And now we're going to waste a bit of time of, I think, right, I've made a note here. Baroness Fox of Buckley. Is that right?
That is correct.
And you're a non-aligned peer. Is that correct as well?
That is correct. Factually, full mark so far, Martin.
It's the nearest I get to royalty. This a non-aligned peer sounds like is it the one in Brighton? It's like but it's lovely to see you. Thanks for spending some time of your time with us. Obviously, you're very busy with going in and out of the House of Lords. What's it like in there these days?
There's only there's so much social distancing, it's frightening. So there's only 30 peers allowed in the chamber at any one time. A lot of it's done by Zoom, like everything else, and it's driving the peers mad. But I've been going in every day to try and get, as a new girl, trying to get used to it. I think it's probably like what it's like being a new girl in a public school, but I never went to public school. But that's what it feels it would be like. I'm getting used to it.
Do you have to dress in ermine every day or anything like that? School uniform.
No, you never have to dress in ermine beyond the one day that you do. But it is funny because there's a lot of fuss made about coat pegs and lockers, things which are not of great concern to me. But people told me that it was so important I got a good coat peg. That's what I mean about I think that this might be some public school hangover. And there's lots of long tables that people sit at in the peers dining room and things like that.
Wonderful. I mean, it sounds idyllic, except for the times that we're in, obviously. But if you do you ever sort of wander around thinking that this is very posh and you're in the wrong place?
Yes, every second of every visit. It's when they call me Lady Fox, I nearly have a heart attack. I can't get over it. And the important thing is that it's an undemocratic chamber, and I disapprove of its existence, and therefore it's a great irony. And I have to work out whether I am a great hypocrite or whether I'm trying to use it as a platform to do some good, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Now, what are the debates like in there?
One of the issues with the debates in that, particularly at the moment, actually, is that they're over formal. There's lists of speakers. You have to stand up one after another, and it's kind of very staccato. There's no real interaction. Now, I believe that in normal non-COVID times, the Lords is better than the Commons at having more spontaneity and people standing up. But and therefore the format is usually much more debate-like. However, what I would say is that, as with everything, things are far more party political than I would like them to be. And therefore, you can tell what people are going to argue. And also, in the sense of kind of open-mindedness, I've been really shocked and surprised, because you think the Lords is somehow a different kind of place, that it reflects some of the preoccupations of our time. So it's far more woke than I was anticipating, for example.
You you hit the woke button quicker than I thought you would. So
I know it is a phrase that I really hate, so it's particularly lazy of me, but it's just that you'll know what I mean when I say the word.
yeah, it's one way of waking up our viewers, I expect, and hitting the buttons on Twitter already. But can you tell me something? You were involved in schools through an organisation called Debating Matters. Can you tell me a bit about that, please?
Yeah, so the Academy of Ideas, which I am still the director of, started a schools debating competition for sixth formers called Debating Matters about 15, 16 years ago. It's now organised through an educational charity for the last 2 years, but I'm still involved very much as a supporter and a judge. But Debating Matters is a form of schools debating that emphasises substance over style. And one of the reasons why we set it up was because I was forever being asked to judge schools debating competitions, and was kind of, I always said yes and so on. But I was struck by how much the emphasis was on, rhetorical flourishes, not rhetoric as you understand it, Martin, but more kind of showing off and ways of explaining things. And there was a lot of neglect on the content. So when we started Debating Matters, we changed the format so that the most important thing was the research that the pupils had done and a cross-examination and interrogation of their ideas, less the way that they performed. And it's been a great success, and we are very proud of the fact that it's kind of gone international. It happens in India. There's been a form of Debating Matters that we started and has carried on in Israel. It carries on in Germany. There's a new Debating Matters competition, and it still operates. We've even managed, or the team have even managed to get it to operate during COVID. So there's now, as we speak, at this very moment, there is part of a Debating Matters Championship online going on. And I keep getting messages from colleagues telling me, oh, that was a really good point that somebody just made, and so on and so forth. So it's not the same, but the most important thing, as I say, is that the pupils, when they speak, they do their formal 3-minute speeches, but after that, there's a panel of judges who don't just sit and judge them, but actually ask them to justify what they've just said, really push them to explain their arguments more fully, and that's really when the whole thing comes alive.
And is it something that's just filled with public school debating societies, or is it across all classes and all races and genders, etc., etc.? I mean, tell me.
So when we started, it's interesting you should say that, because when we started, obviously, I was interested in getting schools that aren't usually accustomed to debating to learn how to debate. So that was my aim, to get state schools involved in debating. But I also got irritated that whenever I went for funding applications, there was an attempt at saying, well, we don't want loads of public schools in, so we'll support it if it's for, socially deprived areas or state schools. And that annoyed me as well, because I wanted a level playing field. I mean, I wanted state school pupils to be able to debate pupils from public schools, private schools. So we refused to make it a state school debate competition, but I think it's something like 89% of the schools involved are state schools. The other thing which you might be interested in is that when we first started, there was a criticism made by a lot of teachers, it carries on actually, which is that the very hard line questioning by the judges would be bad for the self-esteem of the pupils, that they would not be able to cope with that level of criticism, because their self-esteem would be damaged by rather frank feedback from the adult interrogators. Actually, the opposite was the case, which was that the pupils were so relieved that there was a group of adults who were prepared to say that was a rubbish contribution. I don't mean that people gratuitously insult the pupils, but didn't just say, oh, how interesting you are because you're 16 and you've got an opinion, which apparently is the thing that one was meant to do, but was prepared to distinguish between a well-argued case and a poorly argued case. And the pupils themselves really liked it, so it became something of a cult hit. And I think that's to the credit of the format that it does that.
And can people, I mean, talking about pupils holding their own and knowing their stuff and being able to stand up and argue with an adult, perhaps if they are challenged about something. In terms of the opinions that are being raised by students, if they're talking from a woke point of view, let's say, how does that go down?
It doesn't matter. That's not the point at all. I mean, in fact, it's a debating competition. So we provide, or the Debating Matters competition provides topic guides, and those topic guides are an opening 1,000-word essay that gives both sides of the argument in the round, and then there's 4 articles for the argument, 4 articles against, lots of background readings that they can draw on. This is not to confine their reading, but to inspire them to do deeper reading. And part of why we set it up was to say, you think there's only one answer to this question. Well, there aren't. Look, here are well-argued arguments on the other side of why you happen to be. So it doesn't make any, we're not interested in the politics of the pupils at all. We're interested that they argue well. And just as an indication, some of the alumni from the Debating Matters competition, I think we've got the youngest MSP in Scotland for the Green Party. There's a the youngest Tory councillor, I think, was a Debating Matters alumni, and there's somebody who's an organizer for Momentum, who's a Debating Matters alumni. So it's very good to me that we've inspired people to want to be involved in politics, but which politics is entirely up to them.
Right. So it's about freedom of thought for them, not necessarily towing any particular party line, from Momentum to
Absolutely.
the Tories to the Greens. You
Yeah,
name
and
it.
also they've got a topic. So say the topic, one of the topics the other day was on reparation. I think was on statues, yeah, and whether statues should be removed or not. Now, somebody like me's got a well-known position on this, which is that I'm not keen on the contemporary bout of iconoclasm and pulling down statues and so on and so forth. But the point is that it's a very important debate in society about the way we come to deal with historical problems in relation to people being honoured whose views today offend modern sensibilities. And that's an important discussion. And the pupils are given a side in the debate, and they don't choose which side they're on. And they're asked to do the research to argue the best case they can for either of those sides. And the judges are not there to say, I disagree with you or I didn't agree with you. They're there to decide who put forward the best argument. And from the point of view of sixth formers, I think it's just important that they realise there are two sides to that argument, that they look behind the headlines, and then they're not either trying to tick a box to be woke or tick a box to be anti-politically correct. They're there to win the argument for either of those sides. And that's on every single debate topic, that's what you would do.
And you mentioned sixth formers there. Is there age limits to Debating Matters?
We tried to confine it to sixth formers. Actually, we work with lots of FE colleges, but 16 to 18-year-olds, because in a way they're young adult debates, and some schools use the materials from Debating Matters to initiate and discussions with younger pupils, and that's fine if they think that's appropriate. But as an outside organisation, we wanted to very much make it a place where you could assume a certain maturity in attitude and have quite challenging topics. So that's why we confined it to sixth formers, and also partly because I used to teach in further education. I'm interested in that age group, and it's very much on the cusp of them going into that world of universities in some instances and many instances where we know that they will come up against people who will say, you can't debate that subject is off limits, off bounds, and we wanted to encourage a more open-minded approach to debate and discussion.
Right, and you can get in touch via Google, I take it, Debating Matters. A school can get in touch with you that way, and perhaps we'll put the website address.
Thank you, that would be good. I can't remember what it is now, so
Okay,
my colleagues will kill me, and I'll pass that on to you.
No, we'll put it down there, definitely. So look underneath this channel, and you'll see the Debating Matters connector, or whatever it is, link. That's the word I'm looking for. Now, let's move on, because we're talking about pupil voice here quite a lot, and of course, recently it's come to the attention of various newspapers and TV stations that Eton is in a slightly interesting place with its pupil voice at the moment. A teacher produced a video about, I think, for the perspective strand, they called it, that sort of perhaps argued from a certain angle and caused a lot of mayhem. Now, you tweeted something in support of the pupil voice of the Eton students, that saying they should have a right to express themselves about whether a teacher remains in their job or not. And I was a bit surprised about that, to tell you the truth, because should pupils have that sort of power to decide these things?
Certainly not, actually. I mean, I'm not suggesting that the head teacher should change the opinion of the management about whether a teacher should be sacked or not because the pupils argued it. That indeed would go against what I believe to be true. I mean, I think that pupils, I want to encourage them to be, as I've just said, to be thoughtful and open-minded. I thought what was fascinating about the Eton letter, though, was it was a very well-argued letter in defence of being open-minded about what education is. And I think that and therefore I agreed with the content of it. So although I don't support the notion of pupil voice trumping teacher voice, it's not that I think that pupils should be consulted on everything. That's not to suggest that I think that every time a pupil opens their mouth, I disregard it, or I think that they're not interesting. If they've got something interesting to say, then good, I'm prepared to listen. But that doesn't mean it should define policy. But I think the Eton example is a very good example of what we're seeing at the moment, which is, the emergence of a new kind of cancel culture and a really prescriptive atmosphere around what is acceptable to say, what pupils can cope with. And I thought that the film that you're referring to, the Perspectives film, I mean, I've watched that video. I mean, it's had a lot more airplay as a consequence of the teacher being sacked than it ever would have done. And it's a kind of sub Jordan Peterson, attempt at saying, taking on contemporary feminism. About, 3/4 of it I disagree with, but it's a perspectives video. In other words, it's designed to make pupils think. And I have to say that that's to that teacher's credit, that whether that's what he thinks, or who knows whether it's his voice or whether it's a provocation. And just as I've argued about debating matters, there are times when you use arguments as a provocation. It can be a way of making people think. You don't have to always own it. And the head teacher wanted this removing from YouTube, because he said it discredited Eton, and the teacher refused and has subsequently been sacked. The head teacher has stressed it's got nothing to do with the content of the video, which I have to say I myself do not believe, but that's neither here nor there. I think what's interesting is, because I think if that Perspectives video had been done in support of contemporary feminism, in support of the Me Too movement or what have you, the teacher probably would have got a pay rise. I really don't believe the content is unrelated to the reaction. And it also is ironic that he was told to remove it from YouTube because it might discredit the school, when the whole emphasis in this present time is that teachers have got to learn how to use technology properly, and to make films and pre-recorded lectures and so on to encourage educational thought. So I think that maybe the content is what caused the furore. And I was just glad that the pupils constructed such a well-argued defense of why they should be tolerant of different viewpoints and open and exposed to different viewpoints.
It opens up huge areas of discussion. The idea that teachers should provoke thought in the classroom is something, of course, that came to the fore recently in France with Samuel Paty, and showing the cartoons of Mohammed, which hugely unfortunate events took place there. Should teachers be devil's, stick to facts and let students find out things for themselves about politics, about the social world we live in, the cultural world, and just stick to facts, stick to the subjects, and leave the wider world for other people to talk about?
So generally in the curriculum, it's not even so much facts, but there is a body of knowledge that one is passing on. And in the course of passing that knowledge on, to a certain extent, that is a place where you are more interested in, not necessarily in just provoking for the sake of it. But, there's a lot of discussion as well that schools should have a broader role in encouraging young people to be good citizens. And we have citizenship lessons in some instances, or a PSHE, or those kind of classes, in which there is an ambiguity about whether what you're doing is passing on a curriculum. So I think that part of your role as a teacher is to encourage people to not just see knowledge as, these are the facts, write them down, that's the end of the story. I mean, it's not a question of saying to the pupils, if I say black, you say white, just for the sake of it, but that you make them aware of the contentious nature, particularly this is, by the way, sixth formers at Eton, you make them aware of the fact that there are different perspectives, and you do want to encourage young people to be able to engage critically in material. So it just seems to me that there are different techniques you can do that through. And I've suggested that debating competition is one way. That's what Debate Matters does. This teacher did it through these perspectives videos, in which you take a quite extreme example and argue it, and that stimulates thought. You give them a lot of material. There wasn't anything in the video that couldn't be contested and that you couldn't have an argument with. In fact, if anything, when I watched it, I wanted an argument with the teacher. I assumed that's what would happen. You didn't just sit, I'm assuming that the Eton pupils wouldn't just sit and write it all down and then repeat it verbatim. That's not really the point. So I think that's the difficulty. Now, you mentioned the Samuel Paty example. I mean, and I was glad to see that. I think it's the Free Speech Union are going to do a Samuel Paty Prize for sixth formers. I mean, the Samuel Paty example is a perfect example of a teacher who, in the course of teaching a lesson on freedom of speech, entirely appropriately, it seemed to me, used one of the big free speech issues of recent period, and particularly this is in France, and therefore, what is the big free speech issue in France over the last decade? Of course, it's the Charlie Hebdo Mohammed cartoons, and so that's why it seems to me to have been a very appropriate use of those cartoons. And of course, we know in that instance, Samuel Paty was beheaded. And which is just too gross and awful to think about, that was the consequence. But I think the debate around Samuel Paty is worth noting, because people started saying, well, he shouldn't have done that. There were some people who actually almost acted as apologists and said, well, that was too provocative. It's no surprise it upset the parents of the pupils or some of the pupils. It's no surprise it provoked the reaction it did, as though somehow anything could justify, that kind of gross, barbaric murder that occurred afterwards. But I don't think that it was inappropriate to show those cartoons, but it shouldn't be compulsory that you do. That has to be in the judgment of a teacher about how they want to encourage their pupils to think.
Yeah, and it's obviously something when I was at school, teachers were ultra conservative, if anything. They would, not blaspheme. They would certainly not represent views that perhaps challenge the Queen, the flag, and all these things, except for the younger teachers with beards and or longer hair, and tie-dye shirts or whatever. They were starting to come through. So perhaps there was a bit of challenge going on there. But should the teacher be representing their own views or the views of wider society in these things? So you're saying about whether the Eton teacher was representing his own views or not, with no one's sure necessarily about that. But whether the discussion, the provocations should be coming from different angles, and the teacher saying, now, if you were a libertarian, you might think this, a conservative might think this, someone who is for Irish republicanism or whatever might think these things. I mean, what do you think about the teacher representing views and saying where these views come from, rather than just going for provocation?
So it's not that I think that provocation is the only way, but I would hate to say that it should be banned. That's the point I'm making. Your point about how you do it, saying that this is the libertarian point of view, this is the mainstream social democrat point of view. I mean, that is a completely fair way of doing it as well. But I don't think you can just say there's a one shop fits all. But where I think you see the dilemma is actually another controversy that we've had in schools recently, which is the teaching of critical race theory. And there's been a lot of controversy, in fact, over, and the government have spoken out about whether critical race theory and some of the theories associated with Black Lives Matters, such as unconscious bias, should be taught as fact. Whether white fragility or white supremacy is fact, whether the notion that as identified, that if you are white, you are inherently privileged, is something that should be said to pupils, because the argument is also that to be white is effectively you're inherently racist. And I can understand that the government, being lobbied by lots of people I know actually, wanted to nip that in the bud and suggest that to present that as fact rather than as one of the theories surrounding racism or anti-racism was a much more appropriate thing to do. But I got very anxious when the government intervened in this, because they started to say, in some ways, you can't teach that, or you've got, we want to ban certain ways of teaching certain perspectives and being taught. And I felt uncomfortable, because I certainly know that as a teacher, I didn't try and pretend I didn't have views. I just didn't pretend that they were the only views in town. I think especially with older peoples, to kind of do this, studied neutrality isn't necessarily very engaging. And you say about provocations, we're talking about political issues here. I think you can be provocative in different ways. I have taught texts where I've said I hate this text. You know what I mean? And I've taught it. You know what I mean? I've said this is considered to be a classic. I'm not particularly a fan of it, and used different ways of engaging the pupils in having arguments about this is about literature, right? So do you always have to kind of remove your personality? Partly teaching is about a relationship building with pupils, isn't it? And so you have to, in some ways, be present. Now, that's not the same to me as being manipulative, where you make it clear that only one view is acceptable. And I think one of the problems I had with the critical race theory was the assumption was, this is critical race theory, it is a theory. If you don't agree with it, you are a racist who are in denial of your racist views. That doesn't give you much room as a pupil, by the way, to negotiate your way around it. And it was particularly because it was being rolled out for pupils, much younger pupils. But you were asking about pupils' voice. One of them we get into difficulty is that one of the reasons why schools were issuing these instructions almost that teachers should adopt this approach was a rather defensive strategy, I think rather naive one in some instances, because they felt under pressure from organised people around, supposedly around Black Lives Matters, but an organised group of people on the race question, who were sending out, who had a kind of pupil voice section, and were encouraging pupils to complain about racism in the school and to identify teachers who they say had been racist in the past in some way, to complain that there were racist practices in the schools. And I think a lot of schools became very defensive. And that gets us back to this point about, should a school respond when people say, we demand that there is more emphasis in the curriculum on slavery or on colonialism? Should the school, just because the pupils demand it, do it? And of course, I think no, they shouldn't. The curriculum is not stuck in aspic, but if it's to be changed, it needs to be changed within the context of what's appropriate for the curriculum, not just because some pupils are offended and say they don't find themselves represented in the curriculum and then demand that something is changed.
That's a very full answer. There's a couple of things I'd like to pick up on what you just said. One of which was the idea that teachers are involved. They're in the relationship. They should be there in the classroom, and therefore their opinions. So, and if the teacher is Marxist, should they be coming across as a Marxist? I believe this, that, and the other, and representing their view in that way. And is that okay? Because that would, as you implied, go against what the government perhaps were asking for teachers to perhaps remove themselves perhaps more from the classroom, particularly the suspicion is if they are of the left in terms of thinking and perhaps in terms of critical race theory, etc., etc.
Well, this is the dilemma, you see. So I was one of the people who was very anxious about the conformist approach, which was seeping in, which was to effectively treat things like unconscious bias training as though they were legitimate, well-researched, theories that could be imposed on pupils, and in that instance, or on teachers as well, actually. And I wanted there to be a critical awareness of the problems with some of those theories. But that doesn't mean that I think that if you are a critical race theorist in a school, you should never say that you are, deny it, hide it, or be sacked. And I was slightly uncomfortable with some of the government guidance. So you ask about being Marxist. When I taught in further education for many years, I wrote for Living Marxism, and I went on to publish LM Magazine, which was the follow-on from Living Marxism. And when I was teaching, I didn't pretend I didn't write for Living Marxism, right? A lot of the pupils knew I did. A lot of the students knew that I did. And I would joke about it. I mean, it wasn't, was I joke about it? I mean, it was like a sort of thing, we've got a lefty teacher. I personally don't think I'm quite the hippie, beardy type that you were referring to, by the way. And I also think that the difficulty I have now is that what passes for left-wing Marxist ideas in the classroom, things that I don't even recognise as left-wing because they smack of intolerance and censoriousness and so on. But nonetheless, I thought it was appropriate. There were people, these were 16 to 18-year-olds. They could cope with the fact that they had somebody teaching them in another lesson who was a Tory or a Green or what have you, right? That didn't necessarily alter the way that I taught, or or it might have altered the way I taught, but it didn't. I don't think I don't think I only gave them a Marxist perspective on King Lear. Do you see what I mean? I mean, but it might have meant that I had a different perspective on King Lear. But goodness knows there is no one way to teach King Lear. And one of the things that I would be doing was saying, who knows what King Lear's about? Anybody, right? I mean, for centuries, nobody's known what it's about. Or rather, we've all thought we knew what it was about, and then you reread a section and you think, I might have got that completely wrong, because that's the whole point of literature. And by the way, that's even true of history. You say, well, of course, the dates are not disputable. The things that happened are not disputable, but why they happened are major disputes happening. And so once you're teaching A-level history, you're introducing your students to the notions that there are arguments about what caused the First World War, what caused the Russian Revolution, and so on and so forth. And undoubtedly, I think that when I taught, and I did teach, I didn't do it for very long, but I had to stand in as a history teacher in further education, which was not necessarily great for the students. But when I taught the Russian Revolution, and I was a Marxist, you can imagine I was a bit more sympathetic than maybe the Tory councillor who also taught history in the further education, probably had a different slant on it. But ultimately, we were both, as lecturers in a further education college, encouraging them to read the books, in which case they were going to have to work that out themselves, what they thought. And you were giving them as much material as you could so they could develop to think historically, and that's the most important thing in that instance.
So actually, you're coming across as someone who, I mean, to put it in broad sweep terms, who would wish to teach the British Empire next to colonialism, open these arguments out so the pupils themselves can come to some sort of decision and idea about what they think.
Possibly, but it's also the case that I don't necessarily think that you need to have say you can teach the empire without having a kind of, now can we have an anti-colonial section of the curriculum as well. The point is, all right, let me use this example. When I was 16, 17, I had a history teacher who actually was a Lib Dem councillor, and he was teaching British Empire, and he was teaching the history of Ireland and Britain's relationship with Ireland. And I'm from an Irish family, and I was a bit stroppy with my history teacher about why he didn't give us a perspective of the Irish. And his name is Mr. Cattermole. And Mr. Cattermole absolutely tore me to shreds, because he pointed out that if I had a sophisticated, well-read, handle on what Britain thought it was doing, I would be in a position to read more widely about the reactions to what Britain was doing. But as I barely had a grasp on British history, the idea that he was going to start teaching Irish history as well was just a bit much. And I think he was right, because he encouraged me. I realized I hadn't read enough, and therefore I was posturing, and I was trying to get him to give me a political take, not a historical take. So I therefore read much more about what British colonial policy in relation to Ireland was, to the point where I tried to understand that, which then gave me a way into understanding historically what had happened over centuries, that then gave me a grounding to go off to university and develop my political ideas completely separate to the classroom, different point. But what I object to at the moment is this idea that if you don't teach every aspect, for example, you use the colonialism. I mean, if you teach the history of empire, it's not a question of sort of making sure you're not offending people who may have been at the receiving end of that empire, or their families may have been in the classroom, because that is politics, not history teaching. You might decide that you won't teach the British Empire. You might decide that you will emphasize anti-colonial struggles instead, although anti-colonial struggles make no sense unless you understand the empire. I mean, that's the irony. You've got just... So I'm afraid that contemporary discussions about teaching colonialism or anti-colonialism are often not even argued for in academic sense. They're not argued for to add to our body of knowledge. What people will say is, I was insulted by the fact that you taught empire. What about those from families who are, victims of that? We are offended. We are hurt by the fact you aren't representing our history in your curriculum. But if we were to say that we had to represent every person's history in the curriculum, those people who are arguing that that's fashionable at the moment, well, there's a lot of Polish pupils in the class of one of my mates who's a teacher in Haringey. Maybe they should just be taught Polish history, and should they be offended that they're not reflected in the classroom? I'm afraid that this is playing politics. It's identity politics imposed on the curriculum, and it's very dangerous.
Mind you, if they were doing the Battle of Britain, I think the Polish airmen had a huge role to play.
Of course they did. But you might nod to that, but that's not, neither here nor there. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, but it's opening out that perhaps the side that, again, when I was at school, that the entire Second World War seemed to be fought by mainly middle-class white men, shall we say?
Yeah, no, and I agree. I mean, I think that's the thing is, I'm not one of the people who thinks that there should be no. I mean, I want more knowledge. I want the expansion of knowledge. It's like with debates about the National Trust or the British Library or what have you. It's not a question of saying. I mean, when I used to go round. Well, I went to a couple of National Trust, stately homes when I was a child, and it was one of the. I loved all that. I mean, it was like how they live, and I mean, it gave me a taste of history. My mum thought this was because my parents didn't. My mother didn't read much, what I mean, but she kind of like it was a bit Downton Abbey, no doubt, right? But you got a sense of history because you realise that people lived in a different way, both in the past and from different classes. And I mean, that's when I'm like 10 or 11 or 12, right? Now the National Trust spend the whole time kind of apologising for those things, and there's a big controversy as they kind of disavow the owners of a lot of places, and basically, as we know, because they've gone woke, and they basically spend most of their time saying, "Oh, we forgot to tell you, we're so embarrassed about this because actually the owner had a relationship with slavery, and they're in an internal state, and it's got nothing to do with honouring the history of those homes." That's not, but that's not, and I get very infuriated by this, right? That they're cancelling the legacy that they are supposed to be guarding and presenting to the public, that allows this generation's 10-year-olds to wander around houses and get enraptured by history. But that's not to say that I don't think they should say, and by the way, this the owner of this house was a slave owner. I mean, I'm not trying to not limit knowledge. I'm not trying to suggest that we don't tell anyone. But the fact that all that you do is see everything through the prism of post-colonialism at the moment is a particular fashionable way of, and I think that's as distorting a view of history as to only see it through the eyes of a very narrow colonial point of view, for example. So I'm all for widening knowledge, but your motives always has to be to give people more, not cancel one versus the other.
Okay. And one of the ways that teachers discuss all these things is via social media. Now that lessons perhaps are being put into children's homes, so parents perhaps are seeing lessons. The fact that it was on YouTube, the Eton teachers lesson was on YouTube, is one of the reasons why this even got to the point it did. The teacher is, taking perhaps power onto themselves to argue, to say things, to say, this is my viewpoint more and more. And it's sort of undermining, some people say, the management of some schools. I mean, again, the Eton case might be an example that shows that up. But, schools that were doing things perhaps on brain gym in the old days, or neuro-linguistic programming, teachers are getting on their high horses and going on social media and saying, no, no, no to this. Is the expansion of the teacher voice a good thing?
It's interesting that actually, isn't it? Well, it's also that it also raises actually the issue of the parent voice in this, which is interesting. So quite a lot of parents I know have, for the first time, got a glimpse behind the curtain, as it were, of schools, because obviously they've been asked to deliver the lessons or have had access to seeing the lessons that their pupils are having. And in many instances, they're horrified. They kind of say, "Oh my God, I can't believe that you're taught all this nonsense," or, in the classroom. And that's an interesting dynamic as well, because usually, the pupil goes into the school, the relationship is between the pupil and the teacher. And as you say, now we've got, and also often, I mean, despite box ticking, you weren't inspected all the time. So you could get on and teach what you wanted without the head seeing or the SLT having a nose. Right now, you've got to put it all out there, and so on. So, what do I think about teacher voice? I like that teachers are engaged in what they are teaching. I want there to be a dynamic discussion around curriculum and syllabus and how things are taught and so on and so forth. But I suppose I'm anxious about educational fads. I'm anxious about what passes for the latest good practice becoming an orthodoxy and very little room to maneuver. And teachers' voice can be, I mean, I was talking about pupils' voice. I mean, it's teachers' voice that has led to the introduction of some of the more egregious aspects of post-colonialism and critical race theory in schools, because they are the lobby group that actually worked with pupils to make that a focus, rather than it simply being as against what they consider to be the old management, who are old-fashioned. So yeah, so I don't really know what the balance is, but I suppose I'm concerned about how you stop education becoming a political football, which might sound counter to what I've been saying, but I do think that there's a body of knowledge that we have an obligation as teachers to pass on to young people. That is your main job. I'm just suggesting how you do it will vary from person to person. That's the kind of freedom and autonomy of a teacher judgment in the way that they deal with it. But that's not the same as allowing that body of knowledge to be completely sidelined by contemporary fads and theories.
Right. But there is also the moral aspect of what a teacher teaches as well. Things which which are perhaps anti-racist, anti-sexist, and all those ideas.
But I don't,
Part
I
of
don't know
well-being
whether,
and things.
yeah.
Go
So
on.
I'm not sure what the balance is. No, you're right. Sorry, I was interrupting.
No, no,
So,
go on.
but in some ways, I don't think you can teach anti-racism. Full stop. I don't think you should or can teach anti-racism. I don't know what that would look like. You could teach a lesson on the history of anti-racism and how it's changed over the last century. But to teach people that they should be anti-racists is a political. That's different than saying we won't tolerate certain behavior. You know, if you're a racist in the classroom, you can get kicked out, right? I mean, that's a behavior question. Do you know what I mean? I think it's different than saying we will teach it. You can make people familiar with the debates around it. That's in a way what has happened at Eton. That's one of the discussions around feminism and women. So when you talk about the moral underpinnings, you can I don't think you can teach it. You can say that we value and treat everybody equally, absolutely equally. You know, we have a policy. That's a kind of school ethos thing, but the school ethos isn't the same as teaching people it. So that's where I would make that distinction. But when you have a citizenship class, that's what I was saying about Samuel Paty. When you have a citizenship class on free speech, you would raise the provocative free speech issues of a particular period, which is what he was doing in his class. But you are not telling people. I mean, I'm an anti-racist, but I don't think that you can demand that pupils are anti-racist. No, so sorry, I am anti-racist. I am a free speech absolutist, right? But and I would want everybody to agree with me, but I don't think I can tell all pupils that they have to be for free speech or they'll get kicked out of the school, which would be like what you were saying about, you know, you've got to be for free speech. I mean, it sounds great, but you can't impose that on people. So, for example, if there was often I get invited to talk to sixth formers and they've got a safe space group and they're opposed to free speech for people like me, even though I've been invited and they believe in no platforming. I don't think they should be expelled from the school for that. You see what I mean? Even if the school has got a free speech policy, I don't think you can impose attitudes in that way. You can encourage and create an ethos that would encourage a tolerant atmosphere, but the tolerance would be to tolerate views that you disagree with. And so I just get nervous of using schools explicitly to socialize in political attitudes.
And yet part of school is to socialize. I mean, part of the job of school is to socialize people, whether it be to be polite, to walk on the left in the corridors, and when you go to a job interview, to look them in the eye, and you know, those basic things, but also to not be racist to people in your class because of the color of their skin, for example, and to perhaps change minds on that if you come from a racist background, because that is intolerable to a way of living in the world that we live in, is it not?
Yeah, but that's the thing is you can say you treat everyone equally, and if you're abusive to them, you know, if and it can be on race, it can be on anything, right? If you treat people as inferior and lesser beings, that's why I said that's a behavioural question. Right?
But is that the limits of free speech?
What do you mean the limit? No, the
If
reason I'm
free speech
no,
absolutism said you can say anything you want, but we're
well,
saying,
no,
no, you can't
but
say anything you want.
yeah, yes, but that's the thing is in a school context, you are talking about minors, and there are things that happen there that are very different. So, I mean, you know, you also say stand up when I walk in the room. Some schools will say, but you don't do that in every instance. You know, the teacher can say you've got to be in at a certain time. You know, it's a different thing. You're in a position of dependence, right? They're not equal because they're pupils and they're children in most instances or young adults, but they are not yet considered to be adults. That's the reality. And that's why sixth form was a bit ambivalent, you know, that 16, 17, 18-year-old stage. But nonetheless, you are still dependent on the state. The school are in loco parentis. You are considered. We still have the notion that 18 is that breach from that break where you can be considered to be an adult. 16 to 18 is much more ambivalent. So of course, there will be behavior codes, and there will be, and I'm not saying, I'm suggesting that the socializing aspect of schools is done in the way that you've implied, which is that there are school rules and those school rules must be adhered to, right? That is different though than what I was saying the dangers are of where you for example, say you were to say, so we talk about anti-racism. Let's just use an example. My version of anti-racism is a Martin Luther King, the color of your skin is not important, you should judge people on their character. According to critical race theory, that is racist, right? Now, therefore, we have to admit that even just saying this is an anti-racist school at the moment is a controversial thing to do, right? It becomes mired in a contemporary argument. So it'd be quite tricky to say that, you can't always assume you even know what you mean. To say that you will not tolerate pupils treating each other with disrespect based on their skin color or their gender, or being rude or vile about people or dehumanizing them in any way, I'd be very hard on that. Yeah, that's true. Then if I were to, in a citizenship class, have to teach anti-racism, if I was introducing that as there's a thing called anti-racism, I'd then want to teach that, saying there are 4 major theories of anti-racism that have existed. You see what I mean? And maybe do a history of the civil rights movement to show that, that was the Martin Luther King version. And here we have the contemporary Black Lives Matter version. And these are different ways of approaching this question, and so on and so forth. So I suppose that's where I get nervous about. But the declaration that a school is anti-racist, and then that declaration being used to say that anyone who thinks that skin color is not the important determining factor of your attitudes is a racist. That's what's been happening today. That is happening as we speak. Teachers believe this stuff and are passing it on to pupils, and I think that does 2 things. It makes white pupils imagine that they are inherently racist, which is going to cause a huge obsessive, way for them to concentrate on their skin color, and induces guilt and awkwardness and draws attention to difference, which is of no interest, in my opinion, the distinction of skin color. And for pupils from BAME backgrounds, it puts a focus on them as though they're constantly to be seen as victims of racism, and would potentially make them suspicious of their white peers in classrooms and think they were always being racist. And the whole thing is very self-conscious and unhelpful. So I'm just worried about those kind of issues. And that would be the same, by the way. We're talking about this just because of the focus on it, because of the summer lockdown and the reaction to George Floyd and the international focus there's been on that particular issue. But that would be true in some ways in relation to anything.
And lockdown has affected schools, of course. I take it you're happy the schools are open.
Yeah, I was genuinely shocked that so many teachers didn't want them to be open. I mean, I understand it's difficult, but I was sort of taken aback by the fact that there were people who seemed to, to me, teaching is a vocation. It's slightly going beyond, and that you would, I've got a romantic vision of it. And one of the reasons when I first got involved in teaching, I love all those stories of teachers who'd go out and teach in far-flung places, and walk hundreds of miles carrying books and setting up schools, and the whole history of the Workers' Educational Association in Britain, and that people who would introduce people to knowledge. I sort of see teaching like that. And I know it's romantic and nonsense, but in a way it sort of sums up for me a certain aspect of the vocational thing. So I was really quite shocked. Everybody said, oh, there's a pandemic on, of course you've got to close the schools. I mean, think about the teachers. It might be dangerous. It's a bit like, come on, this is where you'd expect, yeah? Now, I know that it was hard because of government rules and so on to carry on being open, but I'm absolutely delighted the schools have carried on being open, because I've been genuinely upset and worried about the impact of the closure of schools on pupils.
Yeah, and it's obviously been difficult for a lot of schools, and a lot of schools are having to send pupils home. Some teachers are very nervous about teaching in school because of either they've got various health issues themselves, or perhaps in their families that they're worried about taking disease home. We certainly know a lot more about it now than we did
Yeah.
earlier on, of course, when schools were closed. So hopefully, though, with these signs this morning about the vaccine, which is coming online in this country, I think it's the first country to
Yeah.
put forward a vaccine, certainly for older people, then that's probably a good thing. So perhaps there is a silver lining, and in the end, we can look forward to a better term next term, or at least the term after, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting though, isn't it? Because for older people, well, actually, maybe for all pupils, I've been bemused by the number of, this is just informally, socially, people I know, and some of the pupils around debating matters, that cliche, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. Out of nowhere, suddenly all these people who've said, God, I really miss school. And they didn't think they were going to say that. But I think that that's been true. I also think a lot of teachers, when I was kind of moaning, I was more moaning about the teachers' unions, by the way, which than maybe lots of rank and file teachers. A lot of teachers I know said, oh, you suddenly, whinge about going into school every day and all the rest of it. But the joy of being with the pupils, you know what I mean, of being there and the interaction and realizing that. But we never, there's been the generational impact of coronavirus is something else, and I think there's all sorts of challenges ahead for that generation. I do think that we need to be attendant to that. I don't know what you think. I mean, to the table about the exam question, but I also think, the fact that people just say, oh, yeah, we shouldn't have exams and they should just do coursework. And, it's kind of like, I don't think we're honoring young people by doing this. I think that we want to, as much as we can, give them the normal educational experience. And I say normal without apology, because I don't like the new normal. And there seems an opportunist attempt at using coronavirus to, for example, get rid of exams by people who've never liked exams. And then there's all these kind of condescending things like, well, we should just give pupils marks and let them go to university anyway, no matter what they've done. And you think, that misses the point. I mean, they need to be well educated, regardless of marks. Excuse me.
One of the most difficult parts of the whole thing is not making the decision and sticking to it. The idea that you just push at that door and at some point it's going to fall apart, the whole thing, so if you're going to have exams, you have exams. If you're not going to have exams, don't have exams, but don't leave it to the last minute and then take them away from people. That's the problem. And the government has got itself into a situation where we don't believe that it's necessarily going to stick to its principles and what it says.
No, well, that's absolutely right. I mean, that's right, because even if you did say no exams, well, we're going to have a rigorous non-exam examination of the work that you've done through coursework, but it was rigorous, and it was, and kind of, you felt like, well, at least this will give us some indication of what's been achieved. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that, so I agree with you, and then stick to that. I mean, I personally think they should do exams, not just because I'm old-fashioned, but because I do think it's an external way of assessing knowledge, and I think it's actually quite meritocratic, and we should remember historically why exams were brought in, which it was to treat everyone with a level playing field. I actually think that it's a misunderstanding to imagine the coursework is fairer or what have you, because actually it often, if you've got a kind of suite of computers at home, you know what I mean, you know interested parents. You get very beautiful coursework of a slightly different nature, let's put it that way. And I taught A level 50% coursework, 50% exam, and extended essays and so on. It wasn't a syllabus I like, but I like, there's merit to coursework in some ways, right? But I had real problems with those kind of home issues in some instances. So, but what I was also going to say was just that I think this sort of idea that, well, we've got to be fair to the pupils and make sure that they are able to go to, that we give them good marks and so on to compensate for the fact they haven't been taught. That's what I'm saying. I mean, you literally get that kind of, aren't everybody saying let's up them a grade? It's like, sort of, what's that? Why? That's missing the point. Because what you're missing is the knowledge, not the grade.
Yeah, it's a really difficult issue, and of course, a lot of kids are missing the knowledge because they keep getting sent home for whatever reason. Usually
And
because they're in a bubble with someone who's got COVID. Perhaps
yeah,
they've got COVID, perhaps they haven't. But
yeah.
in some areas of the country, kids are getting sent home 6 or 7 times. Other areas of the country, not at all, and that's where the concern about fairness comes in, I think.
Actually, just to say, because just in that sort of fairness question, we were having, I think it was Academy of Ideas Education Forum that, they've had quite a few meetings during the lockdowns and so on, Zoom meetings, and we were having one about whether pupils and online teaching, and somebody there from the NEU was very defensively explaining how much work it is to do Zoom and online teaching, and how hard everyone was working. And it was extraordinary because there were one or two parents in the room who put their hands up and spoke in that, and maybe and one of them just said that their child had not had any contact with the school at all. This was like 4 months in, you know what I
Mm.
mean, with no contact at all. And people almost didn't believe them. Then somebody else put their hand up and said, well, I can assure you my daughter has been brilliantly, so, had fantastic input from the school, but my sister's kids have had, 2 emails, right? I mean, it's you're not attacking all teachers when you say that it wasn't actually the case that during that schools not being open, that every people got equal education. They just didn't.
No.
Lots of them just got nothing. I mean, really nothing. And you don't want to get schools into trouble, but I mean that's what happened, right?
Mm. And I think this is something Lord Adonis was talking about, getting Ofsted to go into schools at that time to have a look at what their offline, online capabilities were. And I think he got into a lot of trouble and a lot of argument about that because teachers were trying to do their best. A lot of schools, of course, had pupils in as
Yeah,
well as
and
depleted staff and all these other
yeah.
things.
Yeah, I mean that's, you can understand what happened. It was a pandemic, and at the beginning, like you say, we do understand. I mean, I'm not trying to, but all I'm
Yeah, yeah,
saying is we've got to acknowledge that's what happened. And also, you were saying about pupils going in. I mean, one of the teachers I know was making the point, they should have had 50 in, yeah, and they were maybe getting 15. This was of children from particular backgrounds and
yeah,
also of key workers. They would get 15 out of 50, but there was no follow up of the 35.
yeah. And
There was there was
a lot
yeah,
of pupils are now being home educated. Apparently, some of that will be properly home educated. Perhaps some of it will be just pupils going off the mainstream registers. And Ofsted, of course, have also recently brought out a report about all the lacking in terms of following up pupils who are distressed and finding things difficult, and how perhaps some pupils have fallen by the wayside, and perhaps what we can do as a society to pick them back up somehow. It's very worrying.
it is. I mean, God knows. I mean, I'm pontificating, and I'm not saying I've got any kind of a solution.
Mm.
I don't know that I have. But it's just that I would like to see the solutions to be knowledge rich, rather than simply self-esteem grade emphasizing. You know what I mean? When people say we've got to give young people opportunities, so we've got to make sure that they can go to, further education or higher education, they shouldn't be penalized.
Mm.
I want people to say they've just missed the equivalent of 2 terms worth of work. You know what I mean? Can't we put on a fantastic summer school for them that's free, that's in wonderful circumstances? I mean, I don't know, I'm making it up, but you know what I mean? Where you want that, or all universities to say, right, as soon as we can open properly, every pupil in the country from 15 onwards can come and have a special kind of courses that they've missed, things like that. But that somehow isn't ever what anyone says. It's always
There's
about
one-to-one
technocratic.
tuition. There's
Yeah,
one-to-one
one
tuition
to.
apparently, and
Oh,
then
right, okay.
but
Yeah,
is it paid for? That's
yeah, yeah. But I
you know.
mean, that's the thing is, if the government said, right, every pupil is now entitled to, one-to-one tuition from, um, public schools, Eton scholars. You know what I mean? But
There's a
no,
teacher available.
yeah, there's a teacher available. You could do a route. But yeah, that kind of thing. It is exactly. There's just something about it where I suppose it's the credentializing of education, isn't it? The assumption is the difficulty is the grade you get at the exam being affected by the not having had the education.
Yeah.
Whereas, as we've also pointed out, by the way, education, even though I maybe leaped over this because I was being defensive about something else, but of course schools are a socializing experience, right? They're a socializing experience, not necessarily through the explicit teaching of particular attitudes, but because they provide a space away from your parents, from your family, where you learn different things, where you learn to socialize apart from anything else, where you learn certain external rules, learn to show respect for adults in authority, outside of your parents, and all of these different things. This was also been missing, right? And this is a huge gap. And so pupils, well, the young have been very, they've also been socially isolated in a way that we are yet to understand the consequences.
Yeah, yeah. And as a parent, I understand that very personally. Lovely. Claire, it's been great to speak to you. We've covered so much ground, far more than I was expecting, in our little interview. There, you said some controversial things. If anyone wants to perhaps take Claire up on it, there's the comments below. So write things down in the comments below. And if you'd like to come on the program to perhaps offer alternative viewpoints, then please do. We are for perspectives on this show. Claire, you've offered a huge range of perspectives. It's been a great honor to speak to. I'll call you minor royalty at least. Sorry. I hope you have I think you're going to the Lords today. Should
I
it be
am.
called House of Lords and Ladies now? Shouldn't that be it, by the way?
Yes,
Lords
no,
and dames.
I know. I think we'll cope. We'll cope. I'm not going to make that the major campaign of my time, though.
Oh, go on. You heard it first here. Oh, thank you, Claire. Anyway, please come back at some point in the future. We'd love to talk to you again. And for now, goodbye.
Goodbye.
You can run and hide, but you will find that where you go, the blues go. You may think